So yeah, thanks again. And as the title of my talk suggests, today I'll be telling you a little bit about some of the behavioral work I've done in my postdoc so far, looking at exploration patterns and environmental structure and how they shape cognitive maps. So what do we mean about when we say environmental structure is, for the most part, I think we share an intuition about different environments. So some environments are really easy to navigate, and their structure seems to be very legible and easy to wrap our heads around. Whereas other environments are very complex and convoluted, and to get from one place in an environment to another, you have to take many turns where streets are not very easy. So that's something that most of us probably experience when we're traveling, setting aside the fact that probably most of us have not been able to travel over the past year. But taking an example from my life, it would be something like I grew up in the city of Ljubljana in Slovenia. And it has this structure of a very typical sort of old town that extends from the old medieval core into the periphery of the environment as the population of the city grew. But as you can see, the streets are not oriented to any particular axis. So they run in all different directions, and you have to really pick up on the structure of the environment in order to be able to get around. And you also have to use visual cues a lot to get around. So just knowing the cardinal direction that you're trying to navigate in isn't going to help you because the whole street network is on an axis. As was previously mentioned, I then moved to London, which is famously very convoluted and complex. But the same sort of problem applies. The streets don't run in any particular direction. So we obviously know that London is a particularly complex example, also from studies on London taxi drivers who have to learn all 25 or 27,000 streets in this network. But again, there's a lot of navigational difficulty that you can run into when you're trying to get from place to place. And for example, when I moved to London, that was in a time before I at least had a smartphone. And I remember walking around with a booklet of maps trying to find my way around. And several times I did get lost and I did have to find my way out of it. And most of the time, the issue was that the streets that I thought would connect simply didn't connect. So the interconnectedness of the streets that we navigate on is really important for our understanding of where we are in space. And so finally, to complete this journey to where I am now, I then moved to Toronto and then to Philadelphia, and I encountered basically zero navigational difficulties in either of these cities, and maybe partly because Google Maps was more of a thing, but also because both of these cities are extremely grid-like. So it's very hard to really get lost because there's an obvious orientation of the grid that runs north, south, and east, west, and because you simply have to take an extra turn and then you're back where you started. So these are obviously anecdotal examples, but I think hopefully all of us can relate to this sort of problem of having to really understand the structure of the environment and the interconnectedness of the environment to build up a sort of map in our heads. And so when I say a map in our heads, I'm of course referring to this notion that the hippocampus and the entorhinal cortex support the sort of spatial map that might help us get around in the world. And obviously there's been a lot written and a lot said about these maps, but one particularly interesting aspect that I'll be focusing on today, even though I'll be talking about behavioral work, is that these maps seem to be these structures seem to be particularly driven by exploration, curiosity, and this sort of sampling of alternative options. So this has been shown in rodents in a sort of very simple paradigm where the rodents are just running around a circular track where they spontaneously decide to stop in certain locations and explore their environment by just looking around. At those moments when the rats decide to stop and look around, there's a potentiation in their hippocampal responses in their place field, suggesting that even a very simple thing like head scanning can trigger that sort of a response in the hippocampus. Going from that, even once the environment is learned, so in a sort of spatial alternation T-maze task, when the rodent reaches a decision point, so fork in the road, the hippocampal patterns still show these sweeps along alternative possibilities, suggesting that even once an environment is well learned, we're still sampling and thinking about the alternatives. And then going beyond the need for locomotion, even in primates, when they are simply visually exploring an image, so they're making saccades on a still image on the screen in front of them, while they're doing this, there's been reports of grid-like activity in the entorhinal cortex, so similar to what might be observed when they're actually navigating. And finally, full circle. So this is also very important in human neuroimaging work, where the amount of visual exploration that people do, so moving their eyes around the screen on an image, relates to the strength of their hippocampal activity. So there's more examples than this, obviously, that I haven't listed, but this is just sort of an example. So what all of these things have in common, though, is that we sort of have these, we and animals have these spontaneous moments where we choose to explore our environments, whatever they might be. And so I really like this quote that links exploration patterns to specifically map building from an Australian Aborigine from this book called Finding Your Way Without Map or Compass, where they say, I don't go far in the beginning, I go some distance and come back again, then in another direction and come back, and then again in another direction. Gradually, I know how everything is, and then I can go far without losing my way. So it's something about this gradual sampling and building up of representations that helps you eventually build up a cohesive integrated cognitive map. That would be the sort of ideal scenario, but we know that not everyone successfully integrates information into a map. So work from my advisor, Nora Newcomb, and Steve Weisberg, who's now a professor at the University of Florida, showed that some people really can't make cohesive cognitive maps. So what they had participants do was to navigate these routes in an environment called virtual Silkton, which is also the environment I'll be talking about today. So they navigated these two routes shown in red between locations in the environment. And then they were also shown these connecting routes shown in blue, which were there to help them integrate across these different paths. And they were then asked to point between buildings that were either part of the same route or the same trajectory, and between buildings that were part of different routes. So buildings that were never experienced as part of the same trajectory. And what you can do with these pointing data then is to calculate the error of each pointing trial. So lower error would be better. And what they found was that there's a gradation in how well people can do this task. So some people, who they call integrators, are very good at both of these tasks. So they have a very integrated representation of the environment, and everything is sort of fully cohesive in their minds. But then some people really can't put together a cohesive map, even when they're on the same path. So it suggests that some people really can't create a cohesive map in their minds. But so what this also suggests is that despite the fact that all of these people had the same learning experience, so they saw the same routes in the same in counterbalanced order, but they saw them, it suggests that there's something going on in their heads on a moment-to-moment basis that might be really different. And this sort of these dynamics that fluctuate over time might be something that's really important for understanding how we build up a map over time. Oh, excuse me. And so what I'll be asking today is how we extract structure from moment-to-moment experience to build these maps that might help us guide future navigation. So in collaboration with Jennifer Sutton at the University of Western Ontario, we took data from 84 participants who freely navigated in virtual Silkton. So this was an environment that was previously unfamiliar to them, and they had 16 minutes to navigate. They were told to try to find 8 buildings in this environment, shown here with these small red dots, and they all started in the same location here. And so it's a fairly complex environment, as you can see. So it's modeled after a real affiliate campus of Temple University in Philadelphia. But all the participants were told was to try to find these 8 buildings, and that they would be later asked to draw a map. So they did know that they were going to have to draw a map, but they weren't told sort of what to look for or how to approach this exploration phase. And so what I'll show you now is just examples of 2 participants in how they actually explore. So obviously for the participants, this was a first-person navigation view. They were in the environment on a desktop computer, but I'll show you their trajectories of how they navigated. And I'll show you the same exact amount of time, approximately 1.5 minutes, obviously sped up. And you'll be able to see that people approach this task very differently. So the blue dot will be where the current location of the participant is, and their trajectory will be shown in red as they start moving around. And I hope that the video won't be too glitchy, taking into account Zoom. But so what you can see with this participant is that they are moving. They're not just sort of standing in place, but there's a lot of uncertainty. So they keep sort of pausing, then they turn around and retrace their steps, and then turn around again, retrace their steps again, and then they reach this decision point, pause again, and only then do they make a decision. So they did cover some space. They were sort of moving relatively constantly with some hesitation, but they seem to be very uncertain and unsure about where they're going and about their decisions. In contrast, so I'll show you a different participant now. So this will be a different location, but it's going to be the same amount of data, so the same number of time points of exploration. So this other participant, once they start moving, you can see that they move very differently. So they seem much more confident, and they're moving fairly constantly. They're not really pausing at any of the decision points, and they're just sort of continuing along and making these turns pretty rapidly. But for both of these participants, this was a fully unfamiliar environment. And as you can see, participant number 2 covered a much larger amount of space in the same amount of time. So they saw a lot more sort of new visual information over the same period of time. And how do we then characterize this in a numerical way that makes sense and that we can put into a graph? So this would be the trajectories of all of the participants overlaid on top of each other. So you can see that this is obviously very complex, and that people do pretty idiosyncratic things. So some people kind of explore very broadly and tend to walk around the periphery, exploring the outer edges of the environment. But for the most part, people tend to stick to this sort of central area of the environment. So how do we describe this complex environment in a way that makes sense, that we can sort of relate the structure of the environment to what the participants are actually doing while they're exploring? So the way we thought to approach it would be to use space syntax. So space syntax is a measure originally derived from architecture and urban design to describe environmental structure. And so we're not the first ones to relate it to behavior or even to brain patterns. So in this really nice paper by Javadi and colleagues, they used this measure of closeness centrality, where all of space syntax basically works by describing the environment as a network or as a graph. So for each segment in the environment, so each of these lines would be a street segment, for example, you can characterize how high it is on this measure of closeness centrality. So closeness centrality is very similar to the measure of axial integration, which is what I'll be talking about today, but they both basically refer to how topologically close each of the segment is to every other segment in the network. So as you can see, the warm colors here would denote streets that are that would have to be passed through in order to get from 2 places in the environment most frequently, whereas those in the periphery tend to be cooler colored with lower closeness centrality and integration because they would be traversed less frequently when moving between 2 streets in a network. And so what they observed previously was that actually the anterior hippocampus actually tracked changes in this closeness centrality measure as participants were navigating in an area of Soho in London. So again, I'll be talking about behavioral work, but this is an interesting point that suggests that even that the brain seems to represent something about environmental structure expressed in this way. And so there actually is already space syntax measures on on virtual silkton that were reported by Pagratito and colleagues, and you can see this sort of center to surround organization in virtual silkton. So the central streets tend to have warmer colors, so higher integration, whereas those in the periphery tend to have cooler colors denoting lower values for closeness centrality. And what they observed in their work was that people are actually more accurate at pointing to locations with high integration, suggesting that these locations might sort of structure or scaffold your spatial maps. And these are the measures that we'll be using as well. But so how do we then relate moment-to-moment navigation to this graph structure that we can extract using space syntax? So we can take the map of Silkton with now just a different color scheme, but it's the same representation going from low to high. And if we take a snippet of just one participant's navigation trajectory as an example, what we can do is take every time point in their trajectory, get the coordinate in space where they were at each of those time points, and then extract the corresponding axial integration value for each time point. So what then that allows you to do is to construct this sort of time course going from the start of their exploration period to the end, and each time point would have the corresponding integration value. And then you can simply take the mean of all that, where higher integration values would mean that people spend more time in these high integration areas in the center, and lower integration values would mean that they spent more time in the periphery. And I will say here, to sort of just to preface it, as you could see in the previous plot, people did often go off the path, and we also accounted for the proportion of time that they spent off the path. It was not a significant predictor in any of the analyses, but it is always accounted for. So I just wanted to mention that. So now taking this plot, you can sort of overlay it with all the trajectories again, and then simply extract the parts of the trajectories that are overlapping with the actual street network, and then calculate the mean on a person-by-person basis. And so here each dot is a person, and this would be the average experienced integration. So the average integration that integration value of all the points that they experienced in space. And you can see that there's quite a bit of range. So some participants tend to have really high values, whereas some tend to really just stick to the periphery of the environment and don't tend to explore very fully. But overall, most participants move into higher integration values over time. So most participants do sort of explore the environment and do discover this sort of central organization of the city. So obviously the question that I raised earlier was what the relationship is to spatial memory. And so the way we measured spatial memory was with this on-site pointing task that I also described previously, where again, participants were dropped in front of every one of these 8 buildings that they were told to find and asked to point to every other building. So the lower the error, the better the performance. And they were also asked to draw a map of the environment. And these paper maps were then fed into a Gordoni algorithm, which essentially yields a score between 0 and 1, where 0 would mean that there was no correspondence between the drawn map and the true map, and 1 would mean that there was perfect correspondence between the two. So straight into the data. So I'll be showing the experienced integration values on the x-axis and the pointing error on the y-axis. So again, lower is better here. And we find a significant negative relationship between the two. So the higher the experienced integration value was for each participant, the better they did on this pointing task, suggesting that something about spending more time in these highly integrated areas in the environment seemed to provide them with a sort of scaffold around which they could then build this cohesive spatial map. The same relationship was observed with these Gordoni scores. So here, higher is better. So people who spent more time in these highly integrated areas of the environment had more cohesive, more accurate spatial maps. So that's fine, and that's interesting because it suggests that something about the structure of the environment seems to contribute to these cognitive maps, but we can also express their exploration patterns in a different way. So when I showed you those 2 videos earlier, I mentioned a few times that you can see that these 2 participants moved at very different speeds. So they sort of hesitated to different extents, and they retrace their steps to different extents. So to address this sort of question of hesitation and movement speed, we can take one example trajectory. So here time is on the x-axis and the distance in virtual meters would be on the y-axis. And you can see that there's quite a bit of variability. So there's periods where they're moving very slowly and very little, and there's periods where they move quite a bit on a moment by moment basis. This is the corresponding map. So they cover quite a bit of the environment, but they move at different speeds as they're doing so. So another measure that we can look at is this measure of mean displacement, which also has been used in relation to cognitive maps before in this paper by Gagnon and colleagues, where they were looking at displacement from an origin, and we just simply looked at displacement from time point to time point. So it's essentially movement speed. What I'll be showing you now is the displacement on the x-axis and the pointing arrow on the y. And again, we see that people who moved more rapidly had much better performance on the pointing task. But this wasn't related to their map scores, so or significantly related at least. So it does seem that these measures are somewhat dissociable. And when we, I will also mention that when we enter both of these into the same model, they're both independently significant in this experiment, suggesting that they account for separate parts of variance. But so what you also might be thinking, or at least what we were thinking when we were coming up with this sort of explanation for what's going on, is whether this might be related to the overall coverage of the environment. So you might have higher integration values just because you cover more of the environment, so you explore more, and so maybe just seeing more of the possible states in the environment should be better for building up this cohesive map. So to look at that, we took this measure of roaming entropy as a measure of exploration. So roaming entropy has been described as the degree to which one explores a given environment in a given time. And again, going back to this link to, as humans, we like to explore and we are interested in roaming. There's a very nice recent paper that suggests that people with higher roaming entropy in their everyday lives, as measured by GPS, actually report greater subjective well-being and have different patterns of connectivity with the hippocampus. So suggesting that there's something about roaming and novelty in your everyday life that seems to also relate to well-being. And so here's just a small example of how entropy might be calculated. So out of these 16 states, if you tend to spend most of your time in 2 of them, this will be very low entropy. So you're spending a lot of time in just 2 of these states. Alternatively, you can take the same amount of time and the same number of states, but you explore more of the available states, and this will be a sort of example of high roaming entropy. And this is the example, the website where I took this demo from. So on a person-by-person basis, we can calculate their entropy in this environment that they were exploring. So this is that sort of plot of all the trajectories, but now expressed as a heat map. And again, as I was pointing out before, you can see that most people, the people tend to spend most of their time in the sort of center of the environment where the warmest colors are. But some of them also sort of branch out into the periphery. And so what you can do is construct this sort of 50 by 50 grid for each participant, and then calculate the entropy based on that. So fewer visited states would mean lower entropy. So again, as with the experienced integration measure that I was showing you before, there's quite a bit of spread in terms of the entropy. And I'll also mention that integration and entropy are related, but quite weakly, so not significantly. And what we, and here's just like an example of a high entropy participant. So you can see that they cover quite a few states in the environment, and they tend to branch out quite a bit. Whereas a low entropy participant, the maps don't look dramatically different. It's not like they just stay in one place and don't move. They are definitely moving, but you can see that the colors are somewhat warmer. So they tend to pause more and stay in more in smaller areas of the environment while they're exploring. And so what we can do is relate this entropy measure on a participant by participant basis to their spatial memory, as I was showing you before. So roaming entropy is now on the x-axis. And interestingly, we find absolutely no significant relationship to cognitive maps with roaming entropy. So in neither the pointing error measure or the Gardoni score. So it seems to be very, the amount of coverage of a particular environment in this particular environment doesn't seem to relate to the quality of cognitive maps. I will say, however, speculatively, that it's very possible that because this environment is so structured and people do spend most of their time on the paths, that roaming entropy might not really capture what participants are sort of trying to look for. So there's something again about the structure where because the environment is structured kind of like a city, or I mean, it's a campus, people tend to follow the paths. And so the paths are what's driving the spatial representations. Whereas maybe in an open arena, this sort of measure of roaming entropy would be a more precise one, because it would capture this sort of openness of the space. So what we were then thinking is, okay, so it suggests that people who spend more time in these highly integrated areas in the environment are better at building cognitive maps as they might be measured. But so are these, is this reflective of some sort of strategy? So are people who spend more time in these highly integrated areas doing this on purpose because they can recognize what the structure of the environment is and they're trying to pick up on it? So they're actively, intentionally staying in those areas. So to look at that, we ran a second experiment where we collected data from 52 participants and we gave them a few more minutes of exploration, so 25 relative to 16 in the first experiment. And then we also administered the Santa Barbara Sense of Direction Scale, which we used as a measure of sort of trait navigational ability. It is self-report, but it tends to relate to some of these measures at least. So again, here's the map I was showing you before, but now for the second data set. And you can see that, again, people spend most of their time in the sort of center of the environment, but people do also kind of range out and try to see the periphery as well. And so now we had the same on-site pointing measure as in the first experiment, but instead of drawing paper maps, participants completed this drag and drop map building task. So each of these icons represents one of the buildings in the environment, and all participants had to do was to move these buildings into the configuration that they think would build the correct map of the environment that they were navigating in. And then what the dependent measure of this is a coefficient between 0 and 1 again. So 0 would again mean no correspondence to the true map, and 1 would mean perfect correspondence to the true map. And so again, experience integration on the x-axis and then pointing error on the y. We again find a significant relationship. So obviously with fewer participants, it's going to look a bit messier. But in general, those who spent more time in highly integrated areas of the environment tended to do better on this pointing task. Interestingly, in this experiment, we didn't see a relationship with the model building score. So as opposed to the previous experiment where the Gardoni map building scores were also significantly related, and we're not completely sure why. So one potential explanation is that in this experiment, we didn't tell people that they were going to have to draw a map, which might have biased people to approach this in a slightly different way. So they were maybe not as motivated to create a cohesive representation of the environment. But again, now looking at mean square displacement and pointing error, there was also a significant relationship in the same direction as before. And again, not really with the model building score. So even the sort of displacement measure didn't really capture anything about the model building. And then finally, roaming entropy as before. So there was a sort of more positive relationship than before, but this would mean that participants who roamed more actually did more poorly on the pointing task, but this wasn't significant, and the same sort of strength of the effect in the model building, but these effects were not significant in this experiment. So broadly, what this suggests is that the effective integration was still there, and we replicated it, although the relationship with the model building task was a little bit attenuated. But it does suggest that there's something about the structure of the environment that seems to be reflected in the later ability to draw on your cognitive map. But so is it related to trait differences in navigational ability? And so what I'm showing now is the Santa Barbara sense of direction score on the x-axis and the three measures of interest on the y-axis. And the answer is no, it doesn't seem to be related to trait differences, at least as expressed by self-report, which to us was quite interesting because we really did think that it could be something about the trait ability to navigate, to pick up on the structure of the environment, but it doesn't seem to be the case. And instead, it seems to be that as long as you pick up on the structure of the environment and you happen to end up in a place that's beneficial to building up that sort of cognitive map, you will be able to build a better cognitive map. So that was quite interesting, and it suggests that the way the environment is structured might be driving maps more strongly than these self-report trait abilities. So it's still a bit difficult to say, okay, well, so it's completely down to chance. So is it really just that whichever way you happen to turn at the very beginning and wherever you happen to go at the very start before you had any sense of what the environment looked like, it's hard to say that that's the only factor determining what your cognitive map is going to look like. So another way to look at that would be to simulate different navigational trajectories. So where you're really assuming the sort of baseline chance level of performance. And so what we did was to generate 1,000 simulated trajectories where we kind of try to achieve this human-like chance. So not completely random movement, because people wouldn't randomly step in any direction at any given point, but rather at each of the decision points in the environment, these sort of random trajectories would randomly choose the direction that they would go in, but not backtrack. So this would be something that would look more human-like, where these simulated trajectories would randomly decide at each decision point, but they wouldn't necessarily just go in a completely random direction with no memory of what happened before. And in these trajectories, we match the covered distance and the travel time to the average human participant as well. So what I'll show you here is, so what you can then do with these trajectories is treat them like human ones. So just say for each time point in these simulated navigational trajectories, what was the integration value of the segment that it was on. And so again, I'm showing you this distribution of the real data in the first experiment. So this is just like the box plot I was showing earlier, except now with the distribution around it. And what I'll show you on the right side here is the simulated data. So it's going to be many, many more data points because we simulated 1,000 trajectories. But you can see that in the simulated data, the spread is obviously larger, but the mean is much, much lower in terms of the integration values than the human participants. So it's suggesting that most of the human participants do have some sort of strategy. They don't just randomly decide at each decision point which way they're going. But you'll notice that some participants are very much in the range of the simulated data, and I'll return to that in just a second. And the same general pattern was observed in the second experiment, where again, the human participants' integration values tended to be significantly above the simulated data. So in terms of how this might relate to performance, to look at that, we split the human participants, which I'll be showing you here, into terciles based on their performance on the pointing task. So tercile 1 would be those with the best performance on the on-site pointing task, and then compared them to the simulated data. So we would take the match number of data points from the simulated trajectories and run 1,000 t-tests, and then look at the proportion of those t-tests that were significant. And so, as you can see in the top tercile, there's very little overlap between these distributions. And in fact, 100% of the t-tests were significant here. So the best performing participants tended to always be better than a random trajectory. Whereas the second tercile was somewhat in between. You can see that there's some participants who tend to have relatively low integration values, much more in the range of just sort of a random navigator, whereas those in the bottom tercile tended to perform to have values that were most similar to a sort of random navigator in this environment who just picked at random which direction they would go. And a similar pattern was observed in the second experiment, although it was attenuated, and that was also already shown before. So the distributions were more overlapping in this case. So to tie this up, so what I've shown you now is that different environments may shape exploration patterns in different ways. So I've talked about just one environment, and we have sort of expressed the structure of that environment in terms of this space syntax measure, but we only have looked at this one environment, and it's possible that the measure of integration is really tightly linked to the fact that people had to sort of stick to the paths in order to explore the environment properly. And this is something that we touched on in this review led by Michael Peer and myself with Nora and Russell, where we sort of tried to make sense of the different elements that might support more Euclidean representations versus more graph-based representations, which we can't really adjudicate between in this particular experiment. But it might be that in open environments where you have perhaps only distal cues and no distinct landmarks as you're navigating, as well as no paths when you're actually navigating, something like roaming entropy might be a much more appropriate measure because it captures how much of this sort of available space you've explored. Whereas in grid-like cities and buildings with more navigational constraints, it might be more important to really make sense of the road network as opposed to the entire area that is available to you to really know how these different streets are interconnected. And so what I didn't really talk about is also this effect that local cues and local affordances might have. So how much you're actually looking around in different places. And this is something that is ongoing. So I'm still exploring the sort of best way to approach looking at how much people are focusing on these local landmarks and local cues as they're going about. And then, as I mentioned, so different exploration measures may better describe patterns in different environments. So if you take a very sort of simplified example of two cities, so one would be very grid-like, kind of what I was mentioning before, whereas the other might be very convoluted, but you're looking at the exact same number of nodes in this graph. The way people explore them might be consistent across individuals. So the same participant might explore these two environments in a consistent way where there's a systematic approach to that. Or it might be that there's really something about the structure of the environment that's driving even very different navigators to explore them in similar ways. And so this is something that obviously has not yet been explored, but I think has potential to be quite interesting. And so zooming back out again, I presented a little bit of data suggesting that the structure of the environment seems to really matter for the manner in which we build up our cognitive maps. And so going back to these examples from the beginning, it could be that the way we even talk about different environments can be related to the way that they are best explored. So I think one thing that surprised me when I moved to North America was how frequently people used cardinal directions to describe where to go in a city, because that's not something I was ever used to really in Europe, because cardinal directions are often not very useful. So I think the sort of work exploring the moment-to-moment fluctuations and how people approach exploring and making sense of brand new environments will hopefully be a very useful window into how maps are actually built over time. So with that, I'd really like to thank you all for your attention, as well as, of course, my mentors and collaborators and everyone involved in this work. So thanks.